We are now headed to the UK, where I'm pleased to introduce our next speaker, Martyn Redding. Martyn is an award-winning UK-based designer. He's a chief design officer at Upzello, founder of Design Leader Studio, and a mentor for designers and startups. He was previously head of design for Zoopla, Virgin Atlantic, and More Than. Welcome, Martyn.
Hello, how are you doing?
Not bad, and yourself?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm very well. Thank you very much for having me here today.
Our pleasure.
Okay, so I kind of can't really see you, but I guess that you can see my screen.
Absolutely, we can see your screen.
Okay, fantastic. Well, like I said, thank you very much for having me here today. I really do appreciate being part of this event. I want to just sort of take a moment to recognize the WDO and everything that you do for the community. I think anyone who organizes free events for us and things like this, you really are the lifeblood of our community. So thank you very much for all that you do for us. So my talk is, of course, called the Open Source Design Leader. This is not a talk about open source software. I'm not going to talk to you about how great software is, or in fact, software design. I come from a background of building design teams and running design teams and often scaling design teams. And this talk is merely just an observation from my experiences of doing that within organizations of different sizes. And I wanted to share that with you because I think a lot of the things that I have seen in the past where design has been perhaps prohibited or perhaps not given the best opportunity to grow have been down to some behaviors and some actions that sit within the design leader role. And no, I don't want this to, anyone to misunderstand and think that this is in any way a derogatory point of view or a criticism of the community and the way it operates. I certainly have been a part of those behaviors and actions myself. It's simply something that I've seen and observed, and I wanted to bring to this forum so that perhaps people can learn from the mistakes that I've made. Perhaps people can enjoy a different point of view. Perhaps it's just something that we can use as a starting point for a conversation. So my talk is around 15 minutes. And at the end of the talk, I'm going to leave as much space as I possibly can for questions. And I would really encourage anyone who's watching to ask me anything. And I really mean that. Just there's no subject off limits. I'm very keen to hear people's points of view, people's questions, whether or not it's related directly to the talk and the content of the talk or anything that's surrounding it. I'm happy to answer anything at all. So please do jump in. So before we get started, I want to begin framing this with a short story about Ferrari's Formula One team. And you don't need to know anything about Formula One to get this story. So just please stick with me for the moment. So for those of you that don't know, Ferrari is the single most successful Formula One team in history. They have won more races, they hold more records, they have won more championships, they have the biggest budgets, and that's due in part to the fact that they are the longest running team in history. They have enjoyed unprecedented levels of success within their field. They have reached a level of dominance within their field that is quite unlike many other sporting teams, so much so, in fact, that the sport has a number of times had to change its rules in order to give other teams an opportunity to win and to succeed within the forum. But like most of stories like this, like most stories in which something becomes large and dominates a particular space, there came a period post 2000 when Ferrari were at their most winning, when they had won something in the region of 80% of all races within the last 6 years. The industry changed and the world changed, and technology surrounding the sport then changed as well. And they were no longer able to dominate. Hybrid engines and hybrid technology became the forefront, and Ferrari was stuck trying to learn a new way of operating, because they'd been doing the same thing, working with the same engines for since 1939, I think, so for a long time. Now, this story of dominance and disruption and failure and return, it's a kind of pretty standard story. We've seen it lots of times in lots of different industries, and that's not the bit that I want to focus on today. The bit that I want to focus on today is what happened after this point. So Ferrari are a brand and a team and an organization that is founded upon good design. They invest in it, they understand it, and they have inherently made it part of their organization. And so they knew that they needed to design their way out of the problem that they had. So they hired a whole raft of superstar designers onto their team. They spent a lot of money bringing new talent into the team. They wanted to work in the most innovative ways with designing the new engines to the new specifications, adopting completely new models for working, completely new technologies, and so on and so on and so forth. It was a kind of pretty inspirational and very definitive move towards success. However, it didn't work for them. Their car was not competitive. It was, in fact, very erratic through the races and over the course of an entire season. They were unable to match their competitors, and so it was seen to be an initial failure. And that then led to more problems for them, because out of frustration, people started leaving the team. They were hemorrhaging talent across their organization. Drivers started to leave in frustration. Management were fired because it wasn't meeting their expectations, and the brand was sinking lower and lower in people's estimations. It had a very negative knock-on effect to the whole of the organization, and it didn't make much sense to many people within the organization or surrounding it. The new design team were doing the same things as the design teams in other organizations, if not perhaps in a probably more forward-thinking way, but it wasn't translating to the results that they needed. This then led Ferrari very sensibly to launch an investigation into why this wasn't working and what they needed to do to move forwards. So the heart of the problem, and the real reason that once they kind of dug down into the issues, after a big, long and expensive investigation, was that to kind of summarize it down, is essentially the aerodynamic team and the car build and the engineering team didn't understand the new engine. They effectively had no understanding of how to build a car around the new engine, or what the elements, personality, and conditions of the new engine were. So the problem, and this then stemmed from the bigger problem, because the new design team that had been created at Ferrari was created within a separate part of the organization. In their bid to move forwards and in their bid to innovate and design something that was free from what they described as old thinking or old ways of working, the Ferrari team built a brand new, shiny design studio. And this design studio had restricted access. It was in a slightly different part to the rest of the Ferrari plant. And they did this as a bid to allow a freedom of innovation in amongst that new core design group. However, of course, none of the rest of the organization was allowed in. So none of the rest of the organization understood the process, and it wasn't integrated. There wasn't a singular design vision across the whole organization. and the two parts didn't really work together. So hopefully now you can start to see where this this somewhat long-winded metaphor is going. So the thing that I've seen here, and the pattern that I wanted to kind of call out, is for a good design to last, and for a good design to have real results, or a good design team to last and to have real results, it needs to be integrated into its surrounding organization. A good design, or a good designer who is, exceptional in one organization, if they're transplanted to another organization, may not necessarily find the same levels of success because they're not supported by all of the surrounding teams that need to support it. Because good design requires good marketing, it requires good sales teams, it requires good technology and a good relationship with technology, it requires good onboarding, financing, and so on and so on and so forth. And much like the Ferrari situation that we saw here, you can design things in a bubble, and that is, relatively easy in that respect. But to design something that exists inside an organization and is accepted and adopted inside an organization is the real difference that a design leader makes. And when people ask what the definition of design leadership is to me, I always come back to the same point, which is that a design leader is not necessarily there to tell all the designers what to do. And a design leader is there not necessarily to tell everyone outside of the organization what their team does. But a design leader's primary function inside an ecosystem, a business, a government organization, whatever you want to call it, inside a system, is to ensure that the conditions for good design are there. That design and designers has the best possible opportunity for success. And a large part of that is having the support, respect, and understanding from all of the surrounding teams that are needed in order to get a design into the world and running effectively. So if that's the case, then if design needs these things to happen, and if a requirement for good design is good support, then it leads to this kind of often paradigm, this syndrome, which is often referred to as the acceptance bias, whereby a design team who may need to operate in some way, shape, or form differently to the rest of the organization sets themselves apart. And so a design leader, as we saw in the Ferrari example, may fall back onto the behavior of trying to draw a line around their organization to try and mark them out as special. And this, I think, is the prevailing problem, and the thing that I want to address here with the idea of an open source leader. Because you have these two tensions pulling against one another. One is that a designer is looking around the organization saying, well, I need my own equipment, I have my own language here, maybe we dress differently, maybe we work in a different place, etc., etc. Our processes are different, versus I want you to listen to me, I want you to support me, I want you to fund me, I want you to accept me. And those two things are in a continual tension if a design leader does not create the right environment. And this is not just about how people feel and making people happy, but there's this, a kind of bigger, wider, systematic concern here for design leaders and people that want design to be successful in organizations, which is that if you ultimately cut off your team, if you draw a protective, a idealistic view around your team that it's different and doesn't need to operate openly with the rest of the organization, it ultimately becomes misunderstood. It becomes misunderstood, it becomes misrepresented, and all of the things that make it special can often turn in on one of themselves. And again, I don't mean this as a criticism of other people. I mean, this is something that I've observed, and certainly a trap that I've fallen into in the past, whereby building a design team inside a large organization, all of those kind of things that that all those kind of bad behaviors, I certainly fell into those. It was things such as, putting literal walls up around our space, creating a sub brand of the main organization for design, having our own separate private meetings that no one else was invited into. All of those things turned into this kind of situation. And so if you think about it in terms of the aim here is to integrate as well as possible, and to make as strong connections and to gather as much support for your design team and for your designs and their decisions as possible, then a solution to this is to look to other types of systems and other types of things that have been successfully adopted and integrated. And so as I was doing this, I came across and started to look very closely at the principles of open source software, creating out in the open. So open source software, for those who aren't kind of fully familiar with it, is essentially software that has no central ownership and that is publicly shared in amongst anyone who wishes to access it and modify it and change it and use it for their own purposes. It was the foundations of open source software were put in place towards the end of the 1980s and the early 1990s. From that point, over the last 30 so years, the adoption of open source software has been extraordinarily popular. Today, both the UK and the US governments run on open source software. Tesla is built on open source software. Even Google's Chrome browser is built on top of open source software. It's a phenomenon that is widely adopted and massively successful. So I wanted to take a look at that and look at the principles that make it so successful and see how we can apply that to design leadership and making design as successful as possible. So these are the principles that guide it. First of all, we have peer reviews, which is allowing people to see the changes, to track the order in which things are moving, to understand what's different about it and see progress openly. Number two is transparency, so being very open about how it works, where it works, why it works, etc., etc. Continuity, so a decentralization of ownership. So with open source software, no single person owns or governs it. It's done by peer review and selection, which means there's no bottlenecks. Flexibility means that open source software can be picked up and used for anything from government websites to browsers to financial service software, etc., etc. The applications of it are not limited to it. And open, in that it is there out in the open. The stories are told and widely accessible to everybody. So, I mean, hopefully you can see from an ideological and perhaps abstract perspective why these are good principles and they could be applied. But what I wanted to do is just go over each one and then look at some practical examples for how these can be applied into design leadership, drawing largely from my own experience. So the first one we have is peer reviews. So a peer review, which I don't think needs explaining, but essentially in the context of design leadership, if you're able to share your processes and the way of working and how you're working and why you're doing that as widely as possible, and at the same time lead or get your team or whomever within your team, within your group, to create guides for other people to use your processes, that then allows anyone across the organization to pick it up and feedback on it and understand it, and then potentially start to use those things for their own purposes. In an organization, trying to make everything feed through design is obviously not a practical scenario. It obviously creates a lot of bottlenecks and points of failure. But instead, being able to give people guides for making either creating good design or at the very least making good design decisions helps the entire organization move more quickly. And then the feedback from your peers will give you all of the insights and the information that you need in order to improve those guides and see how they are being applied by other people, whether or not they're working. Number 2 is transparency. So by explaining the point at which you're at in your team, or explaining the process that you're about to go on with your team, so whether you're either building a new team or whether you're simply taking a team from one point of performance and trying to move it up, being very clear with your peers and the people around your organization what stage that progress is at can have huge benefits. If people know that you are just beginning and just starting off, or if they know that you are, and you're very blunt about the fact that you're trying to improve the team, it changes their mindsets and it changes their ability to work with you in a level that is much more empathetic, because they can understand where you are in your challenge. But also promoting your successes and letting people know, and this is something that I have personally had to work very hard at, is taking all of the wins and all of the little moments that happen within your team and making sure that they are visible outside of your team in whatever format works for you as a design leader in your organization. So whether or not that is internal posts on intranets, whether or not that's newsletters, whether or not that's a blog feed, whether or not it's an all hands meeting, whatever those forums are that work for you as an individual and whatever you're comfortable with, and give your team the best opportunity to be seen as a design leader, that's your role, and absolutely one of the most powerful weapons that you can introduce into your process. And the third one is continuity. So that nicely kind of moves on from that point about sharing your successes. If you're able to credit and talk about openly team members within your design group, it starts to move the entirety of the focus away from you, because as a design leader, you become the figurehead of your team and of design, obviously. But it needs to be understood that it is not a singular entity and that you are not the singular point of failure. Because for you as a design leader to succeed, your team needs to be able to operate without you. If your team pauses anytime that you are not available to them, they are always going to be held back by you. And if you are continually needed to approve and run everything within your team, you are held back by your team before you can move on to the next level of your leadership journey. And the second thing that you can do here, and the thing that I am a huge advocate for, because I think this makes a big difference, is to identify people who are outside of your design team, who are interested, engaged, connected to, or have some sort of skin in the game when it comes to design. Take those people and bring them into your organization. And I've even gone as far as creating badges and stickers for those people who've come and spent time with my team. I know that it sounds trivial and perhaps a little bit childish, but it genuinely works if you can find those people who will go out into the organization for you and talk about the great things that are happening within design. And fourth, we have flexibility. So many design processes and many design projects can take months, if not years, and lots of people's time and be very, very complex. And those are great case studies to share with people. However, if you can find opportunities to couple that with smaller, more lightweight examples of how your team has found success, the designs that they have produced and the process that was taken to get there, then there's more opportunity for people around your organization to be able to take those examples and use them for themselves. If there is a range within your showcase of big and small, fast and slow, simple and complex work, and you're openly sharing that, then there's more moments for people to be able to relate to it and use that in their work, and then furthering your need to integrate design and good design thinking throughout the organization. And lastly, we have open collaboration. So one of the things that I like to do when I start building a team or start taking over running a team is to before I go anywhere is to start with all the people that surround my team. So as I said before, the supporting teams, which may be in sales or marketing or technology or hardware or whatever it is for the type of design that you're working on, is to go to those people and ask them their opinions of the team and ask them what their perceived needs are of the team, how they like to work, what they're expecting from design, what they've done with design previously, perhaps the things that have not gone so well, so that I can gather that feedback. I can not only present it to the team, so they're very clear on what we're dealing with as our challenge in amongst organization, but I can play it back to those people to say, okay, I'm now running this team. These are the things that I've heard from you. And then most importantly is to create feedback loops. So showing people where their feedback has been implemented or used or taken. And it's exactly what happens within open source software, and applying that same principle to the leadership, design leadership role can be extremely powerful to bring advocates and support and respect along with you from other parts of the business. So there we have it. As you can see, there's a lot of elements to open source software principles, and there are a lot of very, very kind of clear connections back to design leadership. There's, I think, a huge opportunity for anyone who's leading a design group or team of any size and scale to open up their doors, to move away from ideas of trying to control every single piece of design that happens in the organization, and adopt an open source principle and mentality and approach to it with very, very powerful results. Because I believe that good design needs to exist within an environment that is set up for good design, and that the best design and the best designers cannot operate inside bubbles, like we saw with the Ferrari example, and we need to be much more out in the open. And that's a perfect opportunity for a design leader to have a huge impact on a product, on a group, or a brand, or whatever their kind of particular mission may be. So I think now that perhaps I've talked for long enough, maybe even a little bit too long, so I'm going to hand it back to the group, back to whomever is out there, wherever you may be in the world, to ask me anything that you like.
Hi, Martyn. Thank you. Thank you very much. As someone who recently binged 4 seasons of Drive to Survive on Netflix, I very much appreciated your Ferrari example when you started your presentation. We do, as you mentioned, only have a quick minute before we move to our next session, but we did want to ask a question that came through from our audience. And we have somebody who asked, how to establish an effective interplay between design teams specifically and not individuals. What's been your experience navigating this?
That's a very good question. I'll try to answer that as usefully and as quickly as I can. So the interplay, I think, within design teams is always going to come down to the umbrella of information from the design leader. If the design leader has set a very clear overall vision and overall mission for the team, then everything that happens between the design teams, whether or not it's collaborations or tension or otherwise, should always ladder back up to, is this helping us move to this ultimate goal that we're sharing as a group? I think that's the kind of key difference. And I think it's an extension of the open source principle of being clear and sharing everything that you need in amongst anyone who can support and nurture that environment.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you very much for your contribution today to World Industrial Design Day.
Thank you very much for having me.
Our pleasure.